Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today's call on coronavirus and housing and homelessness. As always, we have a large number of people joining, nearly 2,000 people registered. So I'm going to give it about a minute to allow some more people to join before we get started, and we'll be getting started momentarily. Thank you. Hi, everybody. This is Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining today's national call on coronavirus, housing, and homelessness. As always, we have a large group of people joining us today. We have nearly 2,000 people registered and joining the call today. And it's a wide range of people, everyone from people who are themselves experiencing homelessness, low-income renters, housing and shelter providers. We have a wide range of policymakers, federal, state, and local policymakers on the call, a number of members of the media, foundations, and so on. And I'm so glad to have so many people continuing to join these calls week after week after week. The urgency of our collective work and our advocacy increases every day. Rent is due again on Wednesday, and millions of low-income renters can't afford to pay, like they couldn't afford to pay in June or in May. And now state and local eviction moratoriums are expiring rapidly, and courts are beginning to address a backlog and new eviction cases, and they're putting people out of their homes in the middle of a pandemic and in places where COVID-19 is raging out of control. In Tucson, Arizona, for example, where courts are evicting 52 families every day. In Harris County, Texas, over 2,200 eviction cases are scheduled in the coming weeks. And these are places that are our country's newest COVID-19 hotspots. As of today, 25 states have allowed their eviction moratoriums to expire. And we're just weeks away from the partial federal eviction moratorium expiring. Some states have been cobbling together resources to provide rental assistance and avoid some evictions. And that's thanks in large part to the tremendous advocacy of everyone on this call, both in first getting the funds passed by Congress in the CARES Act, and then by urging your governors and your state legislators to put those funds towards essential rental assistance. But as you know, many of these programs are having to shut down within hours or days after the funds are depleted. The demand is overwhelming the resources throughout the country, and without a quick and significant federal intervention, there will be a wave of evictions and a spike in homelessness across the country. In fact, the wave has already started, and our work now is to prevent it from becoming a tsunami. Every day of inaction puts more low-income renters at immediate risk of losing their homes, and Congress must act with urgency to prevent this tragic, costly, and entirely preventable outcome. We are running out of time. But there are two pieces of good news here, and one of them is that Speaker Nancy Pelosi recognizes the urgency. You all heard her when she joined our call a couple of weeks ago to talk about her intention to prioritize ensuring that a final spending bill includes $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, a broad eviction moratorium, and other essential funding for homelessness and housing stability. Each of these provisions, as you all know, already passed the House as part of the HEROES Act, but today, literally right now, Speaker Pelosi is having the House vote on them again as standalone legislation to emphasize the urgency and to pressure the Senate to act. So that vote on Emergency Housing Protections and Relief Act is happening live on the House floor right now, and we'll report back later in the call on progress there. And then the second bit of good news here is that we have Senator Elizabeth Warren on our side in this fight. And you all know what a powerful champion for affordable housing, racial justice, and equitable disaster recovery that she is. And I'm so pleased to welcome her to today's call. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts serves on the Senate Banking and Housing Committee, and her American Housing and Economic Mobility Act, which she introduced early in this Congress, not only lays out a comprehensive plan to address the root causes of homelessness and housing instability, but with her bill, she really led the way in ensuring that all Democratic candidates for president also put out robust housing platforms, and many of them followed Senator Warren's lead in investing in housing for people with the lowest incomes, centering housing policy on those individuals who need it the most. And so there's no doubt that Senator Warren has helped tremendously in elevating and advancing solutions to the housing crisis nationally. She's a powerful champion for NLIHC's top priorities to ensure that renters are stably housed during and after the pandemic. She's an original co-sponsor of the Emergency Rental Housing Assistance Act to provide $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. And today, I believe, or this week, she's introducing legislation to ensure a national eviction moratorium for the duration of the pandemic. So thank you so much, Senator Warren, for your leadership, most importantly, and also for joining us today. I'll turn it over to you, Senator Warren.
So thank you, Diane. I really appreciate your continued leadership. And thank you so much for pulling all of us together. You know, I'm so pleased to be able to join everybody on this call today. And because you convene these calls, we have a chance that we can keep people in the field connected and share good ideas and successful practices from communities around the country. This is so important. I want to start, though, by saying a very big thank you to all of the service providers and advocates who are on this call. I know that you're out there fighting day in and day out to keep people in their homes, and for those who need it, to connect them with shelter. I know that you are stretching every single dollar of funding that Congress provides in order to do the most good. You are truly the heart of this fight. And I'm going to stay in this to try to get you the funding that you need. We all know about the impact of COVID-19. You know, just one step behind our public health crisis was an economic crisis. And at a time when more than 1/3 of all households are cost burdened and 1/4 of renters are paying more than half of their income in housing, this economic crisis is also a housing crisis. So this is how I see it. I have been fighting for structural changes we need to increase the supply of affordable housing, to bring down rents, and to address our nation's legacy of racist housing discrimination. I have a bill that takes a big step in that direction. You mentioned it earlier, the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act. Now, to me, every one of those priorities seems even more important now than it was when I proposed it. But we also need some short-term emergency solutions to make sure that families can stay in their home or access housing. So, as Diane mentioned, actually it was just this morning, Diane, Congressman Chuy Garcia and I both introduced the Protecting Renters from Evictions and Thieves Act. This is a bill that protects renters from losing their housing if they lose their job or have their hours cut during this crisis, and if they need additional time to make their housing payments. The bill extends the federal eviction moratorium to last 1 year instead of just 120 days as it was, and it expands the moratorium to cover basically all renters. It also makes sure that renters don't get hit with fees or penalties if they need a few extra months to pay their rent. So I'm going to be fighting for this alongside Senator Brown's emergency rental assistance bill, which would help renters make those payments. But I thought it was crucial that we get a moratorium in place. But for me, this is about our values. Preventing unnecessary evictions in the middle of a public health crisis is a moral imperative. It is a public health necessity, and it is also a critical racial justice issue. We just always have to stop and underline this part. Decades of racist federal policies prevented Black families from becoming homeowners. Black homeownership hit its highest point in 2004. And even then, only about half of Black families owned homes. Then thousands of Black families lost their homes during the Great Recession, wiping out nearly all of the growth in Black homeownership that had occurred since the Fair Housing Act had been passed during the Civil Rights laws in the mid-1960s. So as a direct result of our legacy of racist, harmful policies, is that Black families are less likely today to own their homes, less likely to have generational wealth from past ownership so that they can afford a down payment, and more likely to be renters. Many of you have heard that the latest census surveys show that 30% of renters say they have either no confidence or little confidence that they're going to be able to make their next housing payment. But that, for white renters, that number drops to 20%, while nearly 40% of Black renters and close to half of Latinx renters are unsure that they'll be able to make rent. So people may be talking about the 30%, but it sorts out by race. The census data aren't disaggregated by race and income, but we also know that according to the most recent survey, nearly 70% of people who couldn't make their last rent payment or had it deferred have a household income of less than $35,000. In other words, failing to put a safeguard in place to keep people in their homes is most likely to help the most economically vulnerable Americans and to harm communities of color. It could also lead to more families not having stable housing. I know many of the people on this call are fighting hard to connect with people and to get them into emergency shelters and to ensure that individuals who are experiencing homelessness have access to services that help keep them safe. But you need more support from the federal government. So that is why I also introduced the Public Health Emergency Shelter Act with Representative Ayanna Pressley. This would provide an extra $11.5 billion in emergency solutions grant funding in order to ensure that it is easier for providers to use that funding as quickly as possible. So we've got a lot going on here, I know. I just really wanted to talk to you, though, about these two parts of the quilt of policies that we're trying to put together to keep families safely housed right now. I know that I have colleagues in the Senate who are working hard on other pieces, and many of you on this call are identifying emergency needs and sharing new ideas with us. So I really want you to know I appreciate that. Why don't I end there so that I can hear a few of the questions, Diane?
Wonderful. Thank you, Senator Warren. And the two bills that you are leading and have introduced are two of our top priorities to achieve in the next spending package, broad moratorium on evictions for the duration of the pandemic, and $11.5 billion in emergency solutions grants, as well as you mentioned, Senator Brown's bill, which you are an original co-sponsor of, for $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. So we really appreciate your leadership on all of them. We are worried about the delay tactics from Senate Republican leadership, and are especially worried that he seems to keep wanting to push it further and further into July and even into early August, when rent is due this week and people can't afford to pay. So what can you advise us to do to continue putting pressure on the Senate to get action on these essential bills?
What Mitch McConnell is doing right now is just truly unconscionable. People are terrified about what happens when that extra $600 in unemployment insurance ends, when the housing protections end, and when the relief that we voted in March that goes to the states and local communities run out, which means critical public services are going to end, and public sector jobs. A lot of them are going to be terminated, and in fact, that's already started. So, you know, this is really a stew of things going wrong at the same time. So far, McConnell has been clear that he's not interested in working with Senate Democrats on this. Right now, we are expecting Republicans to put forward their own package, but not until after the 4th of July recess, which basically will mean sometime in the second half of July. So look, here's the deal. You all know this. Senate Republicans need to hear from as many people as possible about what's at stake here. Coronavirus cases are on the rise again. Workers still don't have safety guarantees at their jobs. People don't have jobs to return to, and people are going to lose access to the support that makes sure that families can remain fed, housed, and keep the lights on. So you picked the right word in this, Diane. It's about pressure. Please, 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 everyone, not just on the call, but everyone you can connect with, let's call, let's write, let's email, let's text, every possible way to let the Republican senators know that we need relief and we need it now. We've just got to drive up the importance, the urgency of this moment.
Yeah, and we're certainly ready to continue doing our part in that, in putting the pressure as widely and as strongly as we can. Are there specific things related to your legislation in particular, with the Eviction Prevention Act and the legislation to increase funding for immediate urgent needs for homeless shelter providers? What are you hearing from your colleagues about the prospects for these provisions in a final spending bill? Oh, Senator Warren, are you still there?
Oh, I'm sorry, I hit my mute button. I was
Okay,
trying not to interrupt you earlier. Sorry. I was just saying that the Democrats seem to be strongly on board on this. I think we're pretty good on having everyone. For me, it's about focusing on the Republicans and pushing them hard on these first priorities you have. It's also, frankly, about talking to the press, about getting the stories out there about what's happening to families as a result of this pandemic, and how much more widespread housing insecurity has become across this country. So I think those are the key places to come in. We can remind everyone we've already had an eviction moratorium. We've already had expansion of unemployment insurance. What we're really doing is we're hanging on to that, of course, as you all know on this call, expanding the eviction protection. So it basically protects everyone. But I think those are key things to hit.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And we're certainly working on that as well. We have a whole communication strategy working on getting op-eds in key states, key districts. I think it's really helpful for everybody to hear from you how important that is and how helpful that is. So thank you. And then final question is what next after this next spending bill, this next emergency spending bill passes? What are the plans to address, as you said, the underlying issues here and to really make investments in the long-term solutions through your American Housing and Economic Mobility Act? What's the plan for that next, and what do you see as the prospects for that?
So I really appreciate your asking this question, Diane. As I said right at the beginning, we need emergency relief, but we can't just let up. After we get emergency relief, I'm going to keep fighting for the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act to become law. You know, I just want to remind everyone on this call what it would do. It would build or rehabilitate more than 3 million housing units, which would bring down rents across the board by about 10%. It would incentivize local governments to toss out land use rules that restrict affordable housing production. And it would take a first step toward addressing our history of housing discrimination by creating a down payment assistance program for first-time home buyers who are in formerly redlined or officially segregated areas. And every single part of this bill, think about this, 3 million new housing units, it's all paid for just by restoring the estate tax to levels back during the Bush administration and making the rates more progressive for the highest earners. You know, there are only 37 affordable and available homes for every 100 extremely low-income households. And when people talk about how they're going to address the housing problem, they often talk about, you know, they want to expand vouchers and so on, but we have a supply problem. We need more housing units. And expecting that the market is going to fix this problem, it hasn't worked, and it's not going to work in this area. My bill will fix the supply problem, and that's why I'm going to keep pushing on it. I also, just so you know, I have a separate bill that's called for Congress to address the $70 billion backlog in public housing. And it's in repairs. It's the Public Housing Capital Fund. So what I want to do is I want to produce 3 million new housing units, but I also want to upgrade and repair and take care of the existing affordable housing, what we already have. Until we get more supply, we're going to keep having problems. And this pandemic has just shown how many people are vulnerable. So this is a fight I'm ready to have. We'll do the short-term emergency relief, but we've got to turn to the bigger structural change on housing. We need more housing units, and that's what we have to get out there and fight for. We get a Democrat in the White House, we take back the Senate, then we've got a chance to get this through, and I'm going to be fighting for it, and I hope everybody on this line is going to be an ally in that fight.
Thank you so much, Senator Warren. We certainly are. We are strongly supportive of both pieces of legislation that you just mentioned, as well as your short-term, immediate emergency rental assistance and eviction prevention bills. So we're so grateful for your leadership, Senator Warren. Thank you, and thank you so much again for taking the time to join today's call.
You bet, and thank you again for pulling everybody together. This is powerfully important. So stay in the fight.
Thank you, Senator Warren. So before we turn to our next speaker, I want to just ask somebody from the NLIHC team that's on the call to put into the chat box the links to the legislation that Senator Warren mentioned, the legislation that she introduced today for a national moratorium on evictions, the legislation she's introduced earlier for $11.5 billion in ESG funds, and then also the legislation for the longer-term housing solutions that she introduced. She mentioned the Public Housing Capital Fund, funding $70 billion to repair public housing across the country, and the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act would fund the National Housing Trust Fund at $445 billion over 10 years. And each of these pieces of legislations have been really top priorities for the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So we will put the links for those bills in the chat box or the Q&A box so that you can all see the legislation that we are referring to here. And so now we're going to turn to some of our field updates. And we're going to hear first from Daniel Davis, who's the Director of Housing at UMOM New Day Centers. So Daniel, I'll turn to you.
Thank you and good morning. First off, it's an immense honor to be following Senator Warren on this call. In case she's still listening, thank you for being a collaborative champion in addressing housing instability. Good morning from the West Coast, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm the Director of Housing at UMOM. We use emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, PSH, and SSVF to support families, veterans, and singles, as well as youth in Maricopa County. And we also operate the family coordinated system for our COC. Arizona's current COVID situation, as anyone with a phone or TV knows, is approaching dire levels. Arizona is experiencing a new record number of cases and hospital utilization daily. At the same time, we're experiencing consistent daily temperatures over 106 degrees. COVID hit Arizona late, and we never finished our first peak. This has had a substantial impact on our existing programs, but our community has stepped up in unprecedented ways. Around 2/3 of our clients in rapid rehousing have been impacted by COVID, either through loss of childcare and/or employment, which has drastically increased our subsidy spending. A bulk of case management is now crisis case management that is not related to our previous rapid rehousing model, since participants are now contracting the virus and experiencing exhaustion from navigating this pandemic. We've seen recent overdoses and suicides that are atypical of some of our populations, which we've addressed by building closer partnerships with integrated health organizations who can provide telehealth services and connect families to physical, behavioral, and psychiatric health support. We've also expanded our partnerships with state and city workforce efforts to connect clients to virtual job fairs and work from home positions. We've asked funders and the community to fund laptops and Wi-Fi hotspots to produce this stabilization, which they've all stepped up to fulfill. Education during this crisis has been critical. There's a lot of opinion news in Arizona that incorrectly interprets our current situation. So we are intentionally sourcing our information from local public health and data experts. And our development team has been working closely with program leaders to develop trauma-informed messaging to promote safe behavior without fear-mongering. We're focusing our messaging to community providers with a reduced list of in-kind donation requests, primarily what is pertinent to COVID. And local churches from all across a lot of denominations have stepped up making cloth masks for every person we serve. We all know clients are less likely to advocate for themselves due to the disorientation and exhaustion of this crisis. So being proactive with weekly health screenings has been a huge ask of our personnel, but the county health department has been impressed with the results of identifying symptoms early on in a COVID case. We're also taking daily temperatures in our emergency shelter, and we've seen an 85 to 90% participation rate in that effort. Using the family coordinated entry system to get emergency shelter and housing providers on the same page has also been beneficial. Arizona stopped exiting families from shelter due to the 120-day limit to reduce mobility between shelters, and the county has led efforts on providing hotels and temporary shelters to COVID positive and PUI clients. Another highlight in our community has been to focus on using short-term resources to produce long-term impact as our community seeks functional zero. I encourage all providers and COCs to capitalize on existing funder-provider relationships. We're the experts at how the systems work, and we know the solution isn't temporary housing, but decongesting shelters through rapid rehousing and higher acuity interventions to free up vacancies, getting children off the streets and into their families' own permanent housing. One key takeaway that we found is that our research shows providing rapid rehousing and case management is cheaper than providing a few months of temporary shelter with operational staff. So we've made this ask, and the City of Phoenix and Maricopa County have been coordinated their CARES Act funding. City of Phoenix awarded the largest amount of money ever allocated to homeless services, which has expanded UMOM's shelter capacity by 25 units or 100 families served annually, along with an additional 100 families, 200 single women, and 200 single men rapid housing vouchers. Our partnership with Home Inc., who administers our subsidies and provides landlord support, has allowed us to focus on crisis case management. And we've also partnered together to initiate a blast for our recruitment of landlords using different platforms and media connections. And finally, with an immense expansion of funding, it's critical to take heed of the lessons that we've learned on equity from subject matter experts such as Funders Together before further investing our monies into our previous program models. It's not too late to center non-white and non-cisgender persons with lived experiences in our decision-making and commit all levels of our organizations to pursue long-term anti-racism impacts. So the goal has been to take what we know worked before COVID, adjust it to the pandemic, and use these new resources to fully fund our COC's efforts. Thank you very much for the time. And yes, it's already 100 degrees in Phoenix today.
Well, stay cool, Daniel, but thank you for that update. Actually, we have two, one question and one request. The question is whether you're seeing an increase in homelessness and housing stability in the last few months in Arizona.
So we saw an initial dip in the service priority list, and then we've seen an increase in the past couple weeks for singles and families, actually.
Okay, and then actually another question that came in to ask you to talk a little bit more about how you're working with landlords in a coordinated effort.
Yeah, what we've done is we focused on some of the landlords who we know would be really good for media interviews, and we have put them on blast. So landlords like to hear from other landlords, not just providers discussing what benefits they see. So we've really highlighted some of our existing landlord partnerships, and then we've used the landlord support that Home Inc. provides, and we've laid that out pretty clearly. And then we also speak to the tenant support that UMOM provides our clients. Landlords obviously do have business motivation, but then we are also inviting them to help us and partner in ending our community's homelessness. And we have a really cool quote actually that Mayor Kate Gallego said just off the cuff that we've been using a lot, which is helping residents find homes has a positive ripple effect that benefits our entire city. And so we're trying to combine all those different levels to attract landlords.
That's really helpful. And then the request is from Maureen Howard saying that she'd love to have your list to share locally. And so maybe you could share it with us, and then we can share it back out with all the participants of today's call.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, thanks so much, Daniel. Thanks for your great work and for the report today. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to our next field update, which comes from California. We have next Chris Martin from Housing California. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Diane, and want to echo Daniel's comments about the honor in following Senator Warren here, as well as the fact that it is also 100 degrees in much of California as well. So I am Christopher Martin with Housing California. We are an advocacy nonprofit with the mission to ensure that no one is homeless and everyone, regardless of income, has a safe, stable, and affordable place to live. Since the beginning of COVID, California has been really intentional about looking at how we respond with regards to our homelessness crisis, from the funding to regulatory reforms and policy changes that have been necessary. And I'm sure many are familiar with California's effort to house people in an interim setting through motels around the state, and it's the program called Project Room Key. As of just an hour ago, and I got an update from the state that they are at about 15,687 rooms secured, and nearly 11,000 of those rooms are occupied currently. And so recently the state has shifted the name of that program, and I think the name shift really signals the shift that the state's trying to make, which is shifting from the title of Project Room Key to Project Home Key, which is really an effort from the state to think about what happens after the crisis and how we think about the people that have been placed in Project Roomkey and getting them into permanent housing. And so the state, as of last week, agreed to a budget that really looks at this and uses a combination of the coronavirus relief funds coming to the state to allocate in the tune of $550 million to acquire and operate these motels, including master leasing for people that have been part of this Project Roomkey initiative. Additionally, as we advocated for, the legislature included $50 million in operating funds that come out of our general fund because of the tight timeline for using the coronavirus relief funds. And so they additionally added that operating subsidy funding, as well as $300 million that can be used for people outside of the Project Roomkey initiative. Of course, we have 151,000 people here in California experiencing homelessness on any given night. Additionally, the state's looking at some regulatory changes and administrative changes to speed up the administration of these funds and look at our environmental quality law and exempting these projects from that and streamlining the process in the way that they get these funds moving forward, considering they have to be spent by December. So additionally, the legislature is now taking up ways, through policy changes this year to look at how these funds will get used and how the state can start looking at benchmark goals in ending homelessness. We have a pretty comprehensive first in the nation bill, I would call AB 3269 here, which is a bill that requires local jurisdictions to look at benchmark goals and a way for the state to hold local jurisdictions accountable for ending homelessness here. It requires a reduction of 90% by 2028. And so on top of that, we have other bills, another bill that would create a new office to end homelessness that's looking at the state's leadership and how we can provide more coordination at the state level and additionally ensure that racial equity is included in any of the delivery and planning of services here in California. And so additionally, the state's been looking at how we can also think about, using COVID-19 to start thinking about how we can look at our homeless system more broadly and thinking about how we can get away from congregate shelter and using this as a pivot to get away from congregate shelter in the long term, looking at more interim housing. Of course, this was discussed in the equity framework released by the Alliance and NLIHC and partners, and really looking at how we can move to a more interim housing focused response on that front. Of course, this would be challenging in California considering we have over 55% of the unsheltered population in the country. And then finally, I'd mentioned that the state is also looking at both bills to look at the tenant protections and eviction moratoriums in the long term, as well as funding for a rent relief program so that we can really ensure that the massive amount of people that have been affected by COVID-19 do not lose their housing. And so we have bills on both of those, one that would create it would outlaw evictions based from non-payment of rent during the emergency, as well as a long-term rent relief program. And then finally, I'd mentioned to really illustrate that the state's looking comprehensively is that we also have bills, quite a few bills in the legislature that look at zoning reform and density bonus to make sure that we're also looking at both the production side of things as well. So really to illustrate that here in California, we've got quite a few different bills out there and priorities that are starting to look at how we can address the full scope of the need and use this crisis to really jump into a more comprehensive approach, both on our housing production side as well as our homeless service provision and really ending homelessness with some intention here in California. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Chris. That's a really helpful report. There's a couple questions about Project Roomkey and whether the hotel placements are also being provided for families with children, and if so, whether and how there have been specialized program features for those families, either in the hotel sheltering program or in the programs to move them to permanent housing.
Yeah, the motel placements have been, really focused on the three kind of populations identified by FEMA, which is, those that are at risk, those that are COVID positive. And I think that's been really the intention. And every motel has looked somewhat differently throughout the state. naturally just because of the variance in service provision. But I think that there has been some real intention given to the specific needs of each individual placed in there, as well as the families that have been occupying those rooms. But they've been really intentional about meeting the FEMA requirement for that 75% reimbursement to meet those populations. So.
Okay, and so if they meet the FEMA requirements, whether they're individuals or families with children, they are being moved into hotels via Project Roomkey.
Yeah, that is my understanding.
Okay, and also a similar question about whether the shift away from congregate sheltering that you talked about, does that apply as well to families who are homeless with children, as well as individuals in individual shelters?
Yeah, I think they're using this as to look at the entire homeless system to think about how we can shift away from congregate shelter and really looking at all populations so that we can kind of start using this to shift to more of the low barrier approach to and kind of the navigation center approach and move away from these kind of typically congregate settings. And that would be for all populations of people experiencing homelessness.
Okay, and then last question, you mentioned a bill that imposes requirements for local jurisdictions to reduce homelessness. Can you give the bill number?
Of course, yeah, that's AB 3269. That's from an assembly member in San Francisco named David Chu.
Okay, great. Well, Chris, thanks so much for the update and thanks for joining the call.
You bet, thanks for having me.
Okay, so our next field update comes from Wisconsin, and I'm going to turn now to Raphael Ramos from Legal Action, Wisconsin. Raphael, please go ahead.
Thank you for having me, and as the others have said, thank you, Senator Warren, for all of your work championing these really critical issues. So I'm the director of Legal Action of Wisconsin's Eviction Defense Project. Legal Action is an LSE-funded nonprofit law firm that basically provides free legal representation to low-income individuals and families in a multitude of areas. One of those areas includes housing. And our Eviction Defense Project provides free legal representation using volunteer attorneys to help tenants who are facing eviction, to help ensure that they have advocacy and attorneys fighting for their rights. Wisconsin is different from some places you may have seen in the news. Because Wisconsin does not have right to counsel, as in most places. Wisconsin does not have right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. And prior to the launch of our project, what we saw was that less than 1% of all tenants in Milwaukee County who are facing eviction cases had an attorney. So we're working to help as many tenants as possible to make sure that they have representation in this really most critical of processes. And what we've seen with COVID-19 is that COVID-19 and the coronavirus has really shifted the boundaries of poverty and put more people at risk of eviction and homelessness than ever before. In Wisconsin, the impact of that shift on eviction was delayed a bit by both state and federal moratorium and eviction bans and other protections, but those are coming to an end. The state ban on evictions, for example, was put in place in March, covered all renters, and was effective through May 26th. So that ended last month. The federal ban covered a certain classification of people who are covered in covered dwellings, and that's still in place through July 25th. So there's some overlap there, but we already have a segment of the population that's at risk of eviction. There's some other protections in place in our state that are no longer there. Our state regulatory agency passed a rule that prohibited late fees during and for a time after the health emergency, but our state legislature last week suspended that rule, meaning that late fees are now allowed under state law, though they are still prohibited by CARES protections for covered dwellings under federal law for that small subset of properties. And again, the important thing to remember is that all of these protections, unless something positive happens with Senator Warren's work, et cetera, all of these are coming to an end. And what we are expecting, what we are seeing is an increased wave of eviction filings in court. And that's what we've seen since the end of the ban. Eviction filings are happening more frequently than they ever have, though on a positive note, that pace seems to be decreasing. 2 weeks ago, evictions were being filed at a rate that was 44% higher than last year. And there were stories in the paper about lines of landlords waiting outside the courthouse after the ban ended so that they could get in and file. That number has gone down a bit, but it's still high. Evictions are now being filed at a rate 14% higher than they were last year as of the end of last week. And we think that the reason for the reduction in filings relates back to some of the comments Diane made during her introduction and a lot of the work that Senator Warren is doing now, and that is the increased availability of pandemic-related resources. For example, perhaps most prominently, CARES funding for rent. In addition, service providers like Legal Action, community advocates, other organizations around our city and county, and even some landlord organizations have been encouraging landlords to be patient with tenants, to basically give them time to locate and take advantage of these resources as long as those resources exist. The issues we have, though, is that those resources are finite, right? Unless something is done to expand the scope or availability of those resources, they will run out, and they will run out soon. We also have to remember that evictions are still being filed. There were almost 3,000 evictions filed this month alone, and the month's not even done. And they were, again, being filed at a rate higher than before. The other thing to remember is there's still a federal ban on evictions in place for those covered properties, and that ends in July. So when that ends, we expect the number of eviction cases to increase. So recognizing that COVID-19 caused the COVID-19 increased causing evictions is still an issue. Legal Action and other service providers, we've tried to address this to some degree. Our office, for example, reallocated the focus of a lot of our attorneys prioritizing legal representation for tenants facing eviction. We created a COVID-19 hotline to address eviction moratorium related questions and try to help people who are overflow cases that we couldn't help long term. And in our Milwaukee office, we're looking at hiring 2 additional attorneys to try to provide housing assistance, and up to 3 other attorneys in our other offices, either in long or short-term temporary positions, to basically increase the resources that are available to try to help people in court. And that increase in staffing is something we've seen other agencies do in our community as well. And ultimately, we're doing that because we are expecting and seeing a wave of evictions. And it sounds weird to say, but we are hoping that it is just that, a wave, that it comes to an end. As most of the people on this call know, eviction begets eviction. One leads to another. And our hope is that with increased resources, either from Legal Action or Senator Warren's work, that people can avoid the downward spiral of housing instability that even a single eviction can create. And that's not just in Wisconsin, but throughout the country. So hopefully that's helpful. I'll end there and see if we have any questions. Thank you.
That's very helpful, Raphael. Thank you for sharing that, although it is very sobering, of course. The numbers, well, there's one question that came in asking about how many tenants are represented in court. What percent of those requesting help are you able to give help to, and about how many is that?
Sure. So, with respect to us, we would love to represent everyone we can, but we only have so many attorneys. So we help as many folks as we can. Since the launch of our project in 2017, the Eviction Defense Project has helped almost 2,000 clients. For frame of reference, in Milwaukee County, there are about 14,000 evictions filed every year. So we're hitting a chunk of that, but nowhere near all of them. Again, there's no right to counsel, so not everyone gets a lawyer. For comparison, though, if you look at 2016, the last year before the Eviction Defense Project was in place, there were about 13,500 evictions filed and 112 tenants had lawyers. So less than 1% had a lawyer available. So we're doing what we can to help as many folks as we can, but the eviction problem it's significant, and it's not something that can be addressed through legal representation alone, absent something like right to counsel.
Okay, thank you. And I wanted to just confirm the numbers you were sharing, that I did see that, and think I shared some of the news articles around the 44% increase in eviction filings that you said now have declined somewhat to 14% higher than this time last year. Is that statewide, or is that for Milwaukee or a county?
The 14% is statewide. If we're thinking about the same article in the Journal Sentinel, I think that one was with respect to Milwaukee, but they've been mirroring each other pretty closely. Okay. Again, the number is going down, but part of that is, I think, because everything we've discussed, availability of resources, but some of the moratoriums, without getting too far into the weeds here legally, they didn't just stop filings of evictions, they stopped the giving of termination notices, 5-day notices to tenants. So it's possible that a lot of landlords are now giving the notices and they're just waiting to file. So there's an unknown element there, but even at 14%, I mean, that's still a significant increase over years past.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that that's not unique to Milwaukee or to Wisconsin. We're seeing similar numbers in other places where the eviction moratoriums are being allowed to expire. So thank you, Raphael. Thanks so much for your good work, and I appreciate you joining today to share it.
Thank you.
And our next field update comes from Indiana. I'm going to turn to Andrew Bradley from Prosperity, Indiana. Andrew, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Diane, and thanks to all the state advocates and the experts and practitioners who have been on the call, and also to Senator Warren for her advocacy at the federal in this space. So what I want to talk very briefly with you today is an example of some progress from a place that can actually be a very difficult policy environment in Indiana. One reason for that is that our legislature has been out of session since March, so it's been, we've kind of had one hand tied behind our back in terms of being able to deal with housing instability in the face of COVID. But we did have some good news last week. Our Governor, Eric, announced the introduction of a $25 million, what they're calling the Indiana COVID-19 Emergency Rental Assistance Program. It would help 12,000 families, and while our group of advocates we put together that we're calling the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition recognize that 12,000 is really just a drop in the bucket compared to NLIHC's estimates of 258,000+ Hoosiers who will need assistance before this September. It's a good start, and frankly, what's probably the most encouraging about it is that it creates a structure and maybe, if you will, a pipeline that we're hoping to continue advocating to fill with the funding that would be necessary to assist those other 200,000+ renter households. And just like Senator Warren cited the census household pulse data, that's something that we've been doing, is really using data and research, and then also public exposure of that data and research for kind of an inside-outside strategy that's been effective. So on the inside side, we've been taking every opportunity that we can to comment on state plans as they've been coming out. We feel they've been kind of piecemeal and not really coordinated, but that's helped us create a record and a drumbeat for this. Those census data, again, show that 31% of white households had confidence in paying their June rent, but that were not confident. But 41% of Black households were not confident, and a whopping 2% of Latino households were not confident. And we were able to connect that with some of the data about unemployment and job and income loss, and really make that case that we need to see a coordinated, targeted rental assistance program. So that's where we're moving next. Because that first original announcement was done without any sort of legislative or public debate, we've called for an Indiana renter housing stability task force that would include renters and also housing providers, but especially the voices of the Black and Brown Hoosiers who have been most affected by the public health pandemic, by unemployment and job loss, and by housing insecurity. So we're next hoping to take this call to our congressional delegation. We really need to see our House members, and especially our senators, Todd Young and Braun, really become champions on this in order for that pipeline that I talked about to actually be filled and reach those Hoosiers who need it the most.
Great, thank you, Andrew, for that update, and thanks so much for the good work you've been doing in Indiana. We certainly have been seeing some of the news stories that have been coming out that that is based on your work and some of the op-eds and letters to the editors. And we're also seeing movement with your delegation in terms of increased support for some of the federal solutions. So appreciate your good work, and thank you for joining today's call.
Thanks so much.
So I'll turn now to, we've heard a lot of alarming numbers and statistics about increases in evictions across the country, especially in the places where eviction moratoriums are expiring. And of course, we know what the federal policy solutions are, and we're continuing to work towards that. But we invited and are glad to have on today's call Eric Dunn, who is the Director of Litigation with the National Housing Law Project, and he's going to talk about some litigation strategies to prevent evictions. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello. I did prepare some slides, but it's not letting me share my screen. Is that going to be possible, or?
I don't know. May, do we have a plan for the slides? May or Tori?
Okay, well, I can just go without the slides then.
I think, did you send your slides over in advance, or no, you were planning to share the screen?
Yeah, I thought I could just share the screen.
Oh yeah, no, that we're not able to do. I'm sorry, there was a miscommunication.
Okay, well then no slides. So for people who have not seen NHLP's website recently, it's nhlp.org. We have a fairly extensive set of resources now on our COVID-19 page, including a number of memos and litigation materials and other documents for advocates representing people defending against evictions or advocating for eviction moratoria or other measures to stop evictions. Even though in a lot of jurisdictions, moratoria that have been put in place previously are being withdrawn, are being allowed to expire, we still think that where it's possible, advocates should certainly be seeking extensions of moratoria where moratoria have expired, trying to get new moratoriums put in place. I think we're certainly seeing a second wave of cases. Certainly the pandemic is not over with, and the need to stop evictions is far from over with. And so there are a number of public officials from different branches of government that have the authority to stop evictions, that touch the eviction process in some way, shape, or form, and so can stop cases from being filed or can stop eviction writs from being carried out, physical evictions taking place, could stop dockets from being heard, and so forth. And so it's important for advocates to be putting pressure on as many different public officials and as many different branches of government as possible to try to stop evictions. And one avenue that's potentially available to advocates is to go to courts and use litigation as another tool to try to either stop evictions with an injunction or also to create more pressure on judicial officials and possibly other public officials who may be observing those cases. And so on our website, we do have some detailed memorandums discussing different legal theories that may be available to pursue this type of litigation. But the main one that I want to talk about is due process. Normally, a judicial unlawful detainer case is not exactly an exemplar of due process to begin with. It's a summary proceeding. The parties do not have the opportunity to conduct normal formal legal discovery, of which might be possible in a usual civil case. There's, except in a very small number of jurisdictions, there's no right to counsel. There's what's a right to have a lawyer if you can afford one yourself, or if you can get help from a free legal aid program, for instance. But that does generally result in most people facing evictions without legal representation of any kind. And they tend to happen extremely quickly. In many jurisdictions, an eviction case can take as little as a week or a few days. Even in jurisdictions where it takes longer, it's up to a month or maybe 6 weeks or so. compared to a regular civil lawsuit, which can take months or even more than a year. And so that just doesn't leave time for people to prepare their cases and come up with defenses as they normally would. But under pandemic conditions, those aspects of evictions are exacerbated, made even more difficult for tenants to defend themselves. For instance, since you can't do formal legal discovery in an eviction lawsuit, a lot of times tenants have to rely on informal investigation and discovery techniques to try to prepare for their hearings and gather evidence, such as by going to government offices and getting records, seeking information from businesses and so forth. That simply may not be possible when government offices aren't open, aren't providing the same kind of services that they normally are, when businesses are not open to the public or may have closed altogether. The types of evidence and documents that tenants might normally be able to get may just not be accessible, or may not be accessible in the amount of time the tenant has to work with. Courts may be adopting all sorts of new rules and procedures about who can come into the building, and whether you need to wear a mask or not, how many people can be allowed into the building at once. Some courts are even moving their locations. It was recently in the national news, I think, that in Ohio and Columbus, a court moved from its normal facility and set up shop in a convention center to enable people to social distance, which is great from a public health standpoint. It's better to have people in a convention center than crammed into a courtroom. But if people haven't been notified of where to go and how to get there and so forth, then they may miss their hearings. Conversely, if courts have not adopted those types of procedures, then people may be chilled from actually coming into court and appearing for their hearings, especially people who are elderly or have other types of conditions that, if they were to be infected with COVID-19, they could face a potentially, more serious case. They may rationally decide that it's not worth running the risk if the court is not taking steps to screen people who might be carriers of COVID-19 from entering the building, if they're not requiring people to wear masks, if the court's not enforcing or doesn't even have rules requiring social distancing within the building. Or maybe courts will have social distancing within a courtroom, but then you go out in the hallway and people are packed in like sardines. So all of these types of conditions can deter people from going to court for their hearing, can also deter witnesses from coming into the court. So if you have someone who's going to be a witness and testify in your behalf, that person may be unwilling to come to court, or may not be allowed in the building if they haven't been notified of what the restrictions are. Some courts have adopted remote hearing procedures, so people can get hearings usually by Zoom or other type of video conference instead of coming to court, which we think is something that courts should definitely be doing and making available, so that people don't have to run the risks of, coming into crowded spaces and taking public transportation and so forth. The problem is that a lot of courts have adopted these procedures hastily. They haven't thought through all the different ramifications of adopting these procedures. And a lot of times they've adopted these procedures under the assumption that both parties are represented by counsel. When in eviction cases, that's not always the case, but it's often, in fact, most of the time is not the case. Tenants usually don't have a lawyer, and landlords almost always do. So some people may not have access to the kinds of devices or internet services that they need to access these procedures. They may be relying on broken cell phones, or their camera may not work right, or their microphone might not work. It may be an older piece of technology that simply can't access a video conference type hearing. Other people may just not be savvy enough to use the technology. A lot of times there are problems with how you may be able to appear for a video conference hearing, but you can't present your exhibits because the court hasn't thought through a useful procedure to enable you to present your lease or present your payment records, for example. Some people need interpreters, and some courts don't have procedures to enable real-time interpretation over video conferences. Some courts are even using telephonic hearings instead of video conference, where you don't even have the ability to see the witness who's testifying against you, or for them to see you, or certainly not to see what exhibits look like and so forth. So a lot of problems around remote hearings as well that really threaten the fairness and due process for tenants. And so one strategy that we think is helpful to advocates in courts where there are recurring problems with tenants being evicted, where they don't have a full and fair right to confront the evidence against them, to participate fully in the hearing, to present all their evidence and documents that they want to present, maybe even to show up for a hearing at all, is to basically challenge that court, seek an injunction against that court from holding eviction hearings until they correct whatever these due process problems are. And there are a couple of different avenues for doing that. In a lot of states, there are either statutory writ procedures or sometimes common law or constitutional writ procedures that can be used to sue a court and a higher court within that state. It's sometimes called superintendent control or prohibition, where you would basically go to a higher court within that state and ask it to enjoin the lower court from hearing cases, hearing a lot residential eviction cases until it corrects the different types of due process defects that you've identified. Alternatively, in U.S. District Court, there are a number of what are called abstention doctrines and other sort of procedural impediments that you sometimes have to navigate in order to get your case in front of a judge in federal court with jurisdiction to decide it. And those are things that our memorandums will go over. But basically, if you can show that a court in your state is basically carrying out some kind of hearing procedure that in case after case after case, or at least in a particular category of cases, is consistently causing tenants to be evicted without due process, then we think that that's something that can be challenged under the federal statute, 42 U.S. Code, Section 1983. So again, more detail on how to do this in our memoranda, and certainly, if people are looking at bringing a case like this, I'm more than willing to speak with that person and try to provide whatever help we can. Again, this is something that may work on its own, but it's probably best as part of a broader strategy that has a political component, seeking to get whatever local officials, whatever state officials have authority to stop evictions, or at least to slow them down, to exercise that authority and help at least stave off, if not stop entirely, the wave of evictions coming in that state. Happy to answer questions if there's time. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. There are a few questions. One is whether you have any ideas for attacking a summons with a return date of TBD when the court after service just mails the tenant the actual date and time to appear in court.
Yeah, we think one of the real big issues around due process is going to be problems with the summonses, because in a lot of jurisdictions, there may be a statutory form summons. You get a statute which tells the landlord or tells the court clerk exactly what information needs to be put into a summons. And that's usually created under the assumption that the court will be open and hearing cases in person under its normal procedures. And with COVID-19, a lot of courts aren't functioning in the same way that they normally would be. Maybe they're not even holding court in the same place. Maybe certain dockets aren't open. Maybe they're having hearings remotely. And if those statutory forms have not been updated or changed or supplemented with something to truly inform the tenant of when and where and how to have their hearing, then that's, if the tenant is not able to show up for that proceeding, the court may enter a default judgment, and you can't really say that person had fair notice and a real opportunity to defend themselves. So I think in this particular situation, if you've got a notice that doesn't give you the specific date, time, and place to show up, or doesn't have a number you can call for more information to get that that's accessible to the tenant, then I don't think that person's been served with constitutionally adequate notice. And certainly if that person were to be evicted, through a procedure like that, it's something that someone could come back with later and challenge But if that's a regular procedure that court is engaging in for everybody, then I think it's something that would be amenable to the type of sort of collective challenge that I've been discussing here.
Thanks, Eric. And we actually have a number of questions coming in, but for purposes of time, I'm going to ask you one more, and then suggest maybe you can check the Q&A box and answer some there if you're able to. But can you speak to efforts to on civil debt conversion of back owed rent due to the pandemic?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, there have been a number of different proposals that I've seen this called different things in different places, but it's the idea that of basically normally when a tenant doesn't pay their rent, that is grounds for the landlord to evict that tenant. And there may be different state rules and procedures for, whether the tenant has a right to pay that back and preserve the tenancy, or may have some opportunity to go to an eviction diversion program and negotiate a payment plan or some other way of curing that. But ultimately, if the tenant's not able to pay the delinquent rent, typically the landlord would have the right, therefore, to terminate the tenancy and evict the tenant. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, there could be a large number of tenants whose incomes are disrupted at some point. Maybe they're working in the service industry, say, working at a restaurant or some other business that's really struggling. During the pandemic, they may be laid off. Their business may close altogether, and at some point in the future, that person may get a new job. They may be able to go back to the job they had. That person may be able to afford the new rent that comes due, whenever this happens, but they've accumulated an arrearage. From a policy perspective, it really doesn't make sense to allow the landlord to evict that tenant, because if you replace that tenant with a new tenant, the new tenant, replacing the tenant with someone new isn't, the landlord's no better off, because the old tenant could pay the rent anyway, and the new tenant's not going to be paying the arrearage. So it doesn't really seem to be a good policy to allow a massive number of people to be evicted over rent arrearages who could at least remain current in their rent as it comes due. So this is an idea for basically the term we've been using at NHLP is non-evictable debt. We feel like that's the most directly communicates the message, but basically that you could still be responsible for the debt. You still owe the money, but you couldn't be evicted just for not paying it. And whether that meant that you would get help from a federal relief package or a local relief package, or even if you couldn't, you would at least have the right to negotiate some kind of payment plan or something to resolve that debt over time. That's an idea that could keep a lot of people in their homes.
Thank you for that, Eric, and thanks so much for this really helpful presentation. There are a number of questions that we don't have time to answer live, but maybe if you can if you have some time to answer some of them in the Q&A box now, or we can connect with you afterwards and share back answers in follow-up emails to participants. And also, if you could please send us the slides that you had planned to use today, and we can share those out widely as well.
Sure, I'd be happy to do all those things. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Eric. Okay, I'm going to turn now to our next speaker. Really glad to have Bobby Watts, who is the CEO from National Healthcare for the Homeless Council, on to talk a bit about the pandemic's impact on people experiencing homelessness and some updates from their work. So Bobby, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Diane, and thank you to all the fellow panelists and the great comments in the chat box, which means all the attendees that are just doing great work. And it was thrilling to hear from Senator Warren about the possibilities of legislation. So I'll be quick, but just want to say that the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council supports the 300 Healthcare for the Homeless programs. Each one is a federally qualified health center with a special emphasis on providing care to people experiencing homelessness. There's at least one in every state, so hopefully you will know which one is is near you, and they can be a resource to you. We also provide support to the 100 medical respite programs, which are for people without homes who no longer have a clinical reason to stay in a hospital, but without that, they would be discharged inappropriately to a shelter, the friend's couch, or the street, and they would decompensate. So a lot of our work has been responding to our HCH programs and medical respite programs, giving them training, technical support, sharing best practices, what's worked, what doesn't work, so we can shorten the learning curve for everyone in providing care during this pandemic. A lot of the effort has been many medical respite programs and health care for the homeless programs have been providing care in alternative care sites, sort of like the Project Room Key, which I'm glad to hear will now be Project Home Key. But we've learned a lot of lessons. So now we are pivoting as we get ready for the second wave, even though in many places the first wave has not ended. But just what can we do to help our community respond and support people without homes? In a few areas, one of them is through we're expecting that there will be many more people experiencing homelessness, which we've heard from all the work you're doing trying to prevent evictions, but also to help our health centers get ready for to provide care to an increased number of people. And especially that sometimes when we've had these instances before through the emergencies, those who are newly homeless have different sets of needs than those who have been homeless for a period of time or have experienced homelessness for a period of time. So we want to really just work with them, help them, especially in the areas of telehealth, testing. How do you test people in congregate settings and people who are unsheltered? We've learned some lessons. We want to be ready to help communities employ these lessons going forward to shorten the learning curve. So we are just really working hard to support communities and support our community, support communities around the country as far as healthcare, testing, and medical respite, and especially with the focus on care in alternative care sites. So I will stop there. And I thank you all for allowing me to be part of your important call today.
Bobby, thanks so much. I really appreciate you joining the call to share that update. And most importantly, I appreciate your leadership and your good work. So thank you for joining.
Thank you.
So we'll turn now to the part of our agenda where we give updates from Capitol Hill and talk about needed advocacy and steps all of you can take to help us get the policy change that we need to prevent this wave of evictions across the country. So I'm going to turn first to Sarah Sadian from NLIHC. Sarah, please go ahead.
Great, thanks. So as Diane mentioned, right now, as we speak, the House is already starting to debate a package of emergency housing resources and protections. It's known as HR 7301, the Emergency Housing Protections and Relief Act. That includes a lot of resources and other things that are needed to keep renters in their home and to address the health and safety needs of people experiencing homelessness. We do expect a vote on this bill later tonight. So there's still time to contact your representatives and to urge them to vote to approve the bill, and then later to follow up with a call to your senator's office to ask them to take up the bill soon on the Senate floor. So HR 7301 includes all of the housing resources that the House already passed under the HEROES Act. So you might hear HR 7301 or the HEROES Act. It's essentially the same thing. They're all the housing provisions, which includes our top priorities for the next coronavirus relief package. So it includes $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, a national uniform moratorium on evictions for 12 months, resources to, as I mentioned, prevent an outbreak and respond to outbreaks among people experiencing homelessness, and other resources to ensure housing stability. So the House is bringing this bill to the floor to put more pressure on Senate Republicans who are continuing to delay negotiations over the next coronavirus package. Diane asked Senator Warren about that as well. And we're part of that, the effort to try to put more pressure on Senate leadership to take up these bills and to pass some relief as quickly as possible. We also know that today Senator Schumer and Speaker Pelosi issued a letter to Mitch McConnell urging them to start negotiations. And in that letter, they also cite that many Americans are struggling to pay rent and laying the responsibility for that at the feet of Senate Republicans who aren't yet negotiating. So my message to you is to help us continue to build this pressure on Senate Republicans especially, but all of the members of Congress, to pass something to address the needs of renters and people experiencing homelessness as quickly as possible. We know that the Senate and the House are going on recess for 2 weeks, the Senate for 2 weeks starting this Friday. So they will technically be back in their district for you to be scheduling meetings and to call their office. And as Diane had mentioned earlier, July 1st is fast approaching. Renters can't afford to pay. We're seeing moratoriums expiring, and local efforts for emergency rental assistance are being overwhelmed by the need. And these are all things that we really need to communicate very clearly with our members of Congress so that they move quickly. So in terms of the emergency rental assistance bill that we've been pushing for, we are starting to see some progress with Senate Republicans. Last week, I spoke with some Republican staffers on the Banking Committee, and they're now acknowledging more than they ever have before the need for emergency rental assistance. But they are thinking through questions like who should be eligible, for how long. Those are all sorts of technical questions about how to get the money out the door. All of that's a really good sign because they're now at a much better place than they were a month ago. And that's largely due to all of our outreach and because of the needs on the ground. We're also having some positive conversations with other Republicans, including Senator Portman, and just this morning I spoke with Senator Gardner from Colorado. Keep up your work. If you've talked to your offices, your Senate offices, maybe a month ago, it's really important that you continue to follow up with them, maybe every week or every other week, to let them know that the needs are still out there. So in terms of our targets, for Senate Republicans, our top targets are Senator Collins from Maine, Crapo from Idaho, Portman from Ohio, Young from Indiana, Romney from Utah, Gardner from Colorado, McSally from Arizona, Tillis from North Carolina, Murkowski from Alaska, Rubio from Florida, and Cassidy from Louisiana. So please continue to reach out to, especially if you have those Senate Republicans as your senators, and urge them to weigh in with their leadership about the need for rental assistance. On the emergency rental assistance bill, we're still trying to get co-sponsors to that. We've really focused our attention on co-sponsors to Democrats in the House and Senate because we know that this is not likely to be a bipartisan bill. But we now have 40 Senate co-sponsors, and the 40 Senate co-sponsors, 157 House co-sponsors. Most recently, we had Senator Sinema from Arizona join onto the bill. So she's a very conservative Democrat. We were really glad to see her on board so we can show that there's a lot of support across the political spectrum among Democrats for this assistance. But there are a handful of Democrats that haven't signed onto the bill. So here are our targets to get co-sponsors onto the bill. Senator Cantwell from Washington State, Carper from Delaware, Warner from Virginia, Tester from Montana, Manchin from West Virginia, and Jones from Alabama. And I'll say that because of all of your effort, we started off with these offices leaning against signing onto the bill, but we've heard from 4 of those 6 that they're reconsidering co-sponsoring the bill, largely because they've heard from advocates in their state about the need. So if you can, please continue to weigh in with those Democratic Senate offices as well and ask them to co-sponsor the emergency rental assistance bill. In terms of overall timeline, I think we're still seeing that because the Senate will be out of session for at the end of this week and then for the 2 weeks after that, it really doesn't leave Congress much time beyond the end of July. And so we'll have a couple more weeks now to put as much pressure on them as possible to move forward. And then I'll turn it back over to Diane.
Great, thanks so much for that, Sarah. And I will turn right to Joey Lindstrom, also from NLIHC, to talk about some more specific advocacy tools and steps that each of you can take. Joey, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Diane. So first, just really want to echo Sarah's thank you to all of you on the call who have been sending in emails or doing virtual meetings with your various members of Congress. We are seeing some momentum and some progress on some of our key asks, and we're hearing some positive feedback from a lot of congressional staffers, so that's excellent. First, I want to update you about our 2 sign-on letters that are ongoing. We have, as many of you know, a somewhat narrow sign-on letter that is specific to the $100 billion ask for emergency rental assistance and being supportive specifically of the Emergency Rental Assistance Act, the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act. We have 816 organizations on that sign-on letter. And we have a second sign-on letter, sorry for any confusion in that, but the second sign-on letter is related to all of the housing asks that are included in the HEROES Act, $200 billion overall. They include $11.5 billion for emergency solutions grant funding and the comprehensive moratorium on evictions for all renters throughout the United States that Senator Warren was talking about earlier, and that is very, very much needed. So we have a bunch of, a good number of groups on those sign-on letters. These sign-on letters are very persuasive. When Sarah and her team in the policy world do lobby meetings, adding your organizations to the sign-on letter is really important. And so we sent along published copies of the sign-on letters to members of Congress earlier today, but we are still taking new signers, and we will produce updated copies in the coming weeks. And big thanks to Brooke on our field team for her work on that. So we will be sending additional sign-ons. We will, in today's COVID-19 wrap-up email, include links to the current versions so that you can take a look for your state to make sure that your organization is listed, and to also take a look at who should be listed on the sign-on letters, who you think you might be able to recruit to add their names. We'd very much appreciate that as well. If you've been participating on the policy working group calls on Tuesdays that we've been doing, then you know we recently discussed the idea of a broader engagement, possibly a virtual lobby day or virtual lobby days. We've convened as a team here at NLIHC, and we're going to move forward on something like a virtual lobby day. We're working out the final specifics now, but you can expect an announcement on that in the coming day, or in the coming days, that we will finalize a date and produce some new tools for a virtual lobby day for the 3rd week of July, when members of Congress are returning from their recess. But please don't feel like you have to wait for any virtual lobby day to set up meetings with your senators or your representatives or their staff members to talk about the importance of these crucial housing asks. Really, the earlier the better. We're planning a virtual lobby day just to sort of give people a marker on their calendar that we want to make sure that they're getting this message across before the Senate might take action on any spending bill. But please don't wait for any particular event that we're holding to make sure that you're communicating with your members of Congress. And then please, finally, when you're hearing back from staffers or from members of Congress as a result of your outreach, please carry that forward and let us know what you're hearing back, because that informs our ongoing engagements. So thank you again for all that you do, and we hope that you continue to be involved through meetings, through emails, through calls, through sign-on letters, and we appreciate you so very much.
Great, thank you, Joey. So just to underscore a couple things and then some final next steps. One, to just emphasize what Joey said about thanking everybody who already has signed those letters and urging any organizations who haven't signed yet to please do so. They really are a powerful way of showing the breadth of support across the country for these essential provisions and the urgency of getting them enacted soon. Congressman Denny Heck has already introduced a previous iteration of the letter into the congressional record during a relevant hearing. And I believe today, during the debate and the vote on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, that Chairwoman Maxine Waters will be introducing the letter again into the congressional record. So it's really important and has a powerful impact. So please do sign on to those. Also wanted to thank you all for the questions that you've been sending and point you to our website at nlihc.org and the COVID-19 page, where we have a number of FAQs that we post in English and in Spanish. And we use the questions that you ask on this call and throughout the week to come up with those FAQs. So if we haven't answered your questions during the call today, look out for future FAQs where we will work to get those questions answered. And also a reminder of all of the working groups calls that we have throughout the week. So on Tuesdays, tomorrow at 12:30, we have our legislative working group call. And at 3 o'clock, we have our call on working with FEMA. On Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m., we have our state and local implementation working group call. And our next Tenant Talk live call, I believe, is going to be on July 6th at 6 p.m. But we'll send details of that in our follow-up email. But you all are welcome to join any or all of those working groups. And our next national call, of course, will be this time next week. So much more to come. These coming weeks are going to be critical in terms of our advocacy and the importance of us engaging in many different ways to get these essential housing, emergency housing provisions across the finish line. So thank you for all you do. Thanks so much for joining, and we'll talk to you all again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.